Alright guys, so welcome back to Clinical Neurology 101, and once again my name is Shane, and today we're going to be discussing the different classifications of the central, autonomic, peripheral, and somatic nervous systems. So as you can see here, I've broken this down. This is usually something that many scientists and professionals use when they're researching the nervous system, just so that they can kind of break it down into its individual components, since as you can see it's quite a little bit more complex. And if you know what I mean, there's a lot of information to go through, so usually we just kind of break it up like this. And we also have over here the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, as well as the cranial nerve. So we're just going to go through all of that today. So as you can see, it's a little bit more in depth. So you weren't paying attention before, you might want to just give it a little more thought today, just because we are going to be introducing quite a bit more terminology and things like that. So first up, we have the central nervous system. The central nervous system is comprised of the brain and the spinal cord. So anything that is in the brain and in the spinal cord. We also have here cranial nerves 1 and 2, which are nerves that extend from the cranium, and the reason why nerves 1 and 2 are considered part of the central nervous system is because they directly synapse with central nervous system neurons. And over here we have our cranial nerves, and cranial nerve 1, that's the olfactory nerve, which is involved in our sense of smell. Cranial nerve 2 involved in our sense of sight, and that interfaces with the occipital lobe, which is the center of sight in the human brain. So we also have here the olfactory epithelium, which interestingly enough is the only part of the central nervous system that is directly interfaces with the environment. And the brain is located in the spinal cavity, the brain is located in the cranial cavity, the spinal cord is located in the spinal canal. And as you can see here, I've also drawn us a little neuron just before we go into the white and gray matter. A neuron pretty much just looks like a scrambled egg with legs. We have our yolk, which would be considered the nucleus. We have our egg, which is considered the soma, or the cell body. We have our little legs, which are considered the dendrites. And then we have this long thing here, which is the axon. At the end of the axon, we have the axon terminal. And just before it reaches the dendrites of the next neuron, that's the synapse. So when we have our white matter and gray matter, this is what comprises the brain essentially. So when you're looking at a cross-section of the brain, you're going to see there's white matter and gray matter. So when you're looking at the white matter, that's usually comprised of axons, which are these things right here, and nerve fibers. And when you're looking at the gray matter, you're going to be looking for the soma, synapses, dendrites, the axon terminals. So that is the central nervous system, and as you can see, I have our definition here, which is the brain and spinal cord. And we also have up here the peripheral nervous system, which branches into the autonomic and somatic nervous systems. The autonomic nervous system, which is next on our list, that is associated with all non-consciously directed bodily functions. It's part of the peripheral nervous system, and as you can see, that can branch into quite a bit, as I've written down here, which is involved with heart rate, digestion, breathing, respiration, blood pressure, sexual arousal, pupillary response, urinary regulation, cardiac regulation, temperature, vasomotor control, which is heart rate, blood pressure. We also have reflexes of coughing, sneezing, vomiting, and swallowing. This is regulated by the hypothalamus, and we also have our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, which is rest and digest and feed and breed. So all of those non-consciously directed systems, that's the autonomic, or as I like to remember it, the automatic. And up ahead we have our peripheral nervous system, which is anything that is not in the brain and spinal cord, which does refer to the autonomic and somatic usually. Sometimes it can originate in the brain, sometimes not. And anything not in the brain and spinal cord, nerves. We also have ganglions, which are clusters of neurons that kind of cluster together. Nerves that extend from through our limbs. We have our cranial nerves, excluding cranial nerve 1 and 2. We have generally external input and output, the spinal nerves, and then we have some neurotransmitters down here: acetylcholine, noradrenaline, adenosine triphosphate, GABA, dopamine, sensory neurons, and motor neurons. So acetylcholine is just a neurotransmitter, noradrenaline, again, neurotransmitter. ATP, that's adenosine triphosphate, and that is typically what's released in the form of energy when we consume something. Sugar gets absorbed by the mitochondria of the cell, and then it gets transformed into ATP, which is typically what our body uses for energy. And down here we have our sensory and motor neurons, so we're going to go into a bit more detail on that over here in our somatic nervous system. Sensory and motor neurons are usually called afferent or efferent. Afferent, down here we have, is sensory. Efferent is related to the muscles or motor. And the somatic nervous system is a part of the peripheral nervous system which is associated with voluntary skeletal movements, and it's comprised of afferent and efferent neurons. Which afferent neurons are typically things that go outside the environment into the brain. efferent neurons into the brain to the outside of the environment. So anything that you're putting an impulse out there, that your impulses that are going from the brain to the limbs, that would be efferent. Anything that's that it's picking up from the outside, that's afferent. So over here we have muscle contraction, spinal nerves, cranial nerves, interneurons, reflex arcs, which is kind of like if the doctor taps your knee and your leg shoots up, that's a patellar reflex that goes straight from the spinal cord right back down to the knee and kind of bypasses the brain. That's known as a reflex arc. And interneurons are kind of in between afferent and efferent. All of this, the skeletal voluntary control, all of that is controlled by something called the precentral gyrus, which is located in the frontal lobe. It's also known as the primary motor cortex. And a lot of the time you'll see in cross sections of the PMC, there's Bett cells, which are giant upper motor neurons, and most of this is located within the corticospinal tract. So we have our just our basic little outline there of all of that. And then over here, we're going to get into our sympathetic and parasympathetic. So the sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight, feed and breed, and it also helps maintain homeostasis. So anything that you're going to be doing that involves action or excitation, that's going to be your sympathetic nervous system. It's also heavily involved in the role of stress. So if you're having anxiety, if you're having panic, if you're upset, if you're angry, you're ready to go, you don't want to be there, your heart rate's going up, your palms are clammy, things like that, that's all a sympathetic response. And you see the sympathetic response a lot in people who are exhibiting a stress response or exhibiting a trauma response, because the brain is saying, oh, I don't want to be here, I want to be somewhere else, let's get out of here, let's go. It's pretty much an evolutionary fight or flight instinct. So it happens anytime your brain perceives that you're in danger, or that, you know, something is threatening your stability, your safety, things like that. And we also have here just a brief list of the things that the sympathetic response can stimulate, which is an increase in heart rate, widening the bronchial passages, decrease in gut motility, pupil dilation, and sweating. It's also known as the thoracolumbar system because it originates in the thoracic cavity and goes down through the lumbar cavity, which is the base of your spine. The thoraco is in the chest. We also, as opposed to the parasympathetic, which is craniosacral, so it originates in the cranium, goes down to the sacrum, which is head, right down to the tailbone. So here, just anything that you can think of where it's excitation response. Now, pupil dilation, a lot of people think is counterintuitive. It dilates the pupils because when you're in a stressful situation, you want to be able to see as much light as possible so that it's a way that your body's more efficient, so it does result in some dilation. And the way that the sympathetic response is typically stimulated is that there's a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. So a preganglionic neuron is prior to entering the ganglion, which is, again, the cluster of neurons. We have a postganglionic neuron, which is after it exits that cluster. So a preganglionic neuron is going to fire from T2 to L2, which is the thoracic vertebrae 2 and the lumbar vertebrae 2. And it's going to end up going through the ganglion. Then it's postganglionic. That's going to release acetylcholine, which stimulates nicotinic receptors. A nicotinic receptor stimulates or excites. You may remember that by the phrase where nicotine itself is a stimulant. Once that happens, it releases norepinephrine from the locus coeruleus, which I mentioned before, which is the nucleus of the pons in the brainstem. It is one of the precursors to the sympathetic nervous system itself. This stimulates adrenergic receptors, which in organs and things like that stimulates that sympathetic response. So again, we have here where it's danger sympathy, so sympathetic. And the actual reason was proposed by someone named Galen for sympathetic means that it works in connection with. The parasympathetic nervous system, which is over here, it's our rest and digest system. It's responsible for digestion, sexual arousal, lacrimation, which is crying, salivation, urination, defecation. It also deals heavily with the glossopharyngeal nerve, the vagus nerve, the facial nerve, and the oculomotor nerve. Again, that's a craniosacral system. And how that functions is a parasympathetic ganglion releases an afferent or efferent neuron. These release acetylcholine. The preganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine, which stimulates nicotinic receptors, which instead of stimulating an adrenergic receptor, it actually goes into the postganglionic neuron, which releases it again to a muscarinic receptor. A muscarinic receptor, it depresses as opposed to stimulates. And the way that I usually tend to remember that is that muscarinic stems from mushroom, and if you've ever heard of the recreational drug mushrooms, they tend to be a depressant, so that's usually how I remember that. And so yeah, that's just a general introduction to sympathetic parasympathetic. Also over here we do have our cranial nerves, and I'm going to go into some detail. Cranial nerve 1 is our olfactory nerve. Cranial nerve 2 is our optic nerve. It's responsible for facilitating our vision that interfaces with the occipital lobe. We have cranial nerve 3, which is the ocular motor nerve, which determines the eye movements. The trochlear nerve, that's cranial nerve 4, that also assists with it. It only innervates a single muscle, which is the superior oblique muscle of the eye, which abducts or lets up, depresses and rotates the eye. We have the facial nerve, which innervates the face, the vestibulocochlear nerve, which helps with balance, rotation, spatial orientation. We have the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is the tongue. The glossopharyngeal nerve is associated with bitter, sour, gag reflex, swallowing, and coughing. I kind of have these written down here just so you can kind of take a better look. We have the vagus nerve, which is a cardiac and digestion. So it's actually known as the pneumogastric nerve, and they're actually a pair of nerves, but they're usually referred to as a single entity in this case. We have the accessory nerve, which is responsible for the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius, which we have down here. It's a big long word. The sternocleidomastoid is that big muscle in your neck. When you turn your neck like that and you can feel the muscle there, that's the sternocleidomastoid. Your trapezius is all along your shoulders. And finally, we have the hypoglossal nerve, which is the tongue itself, movement of the tongue. So that concludes our brief introduction to the different types of nervous systems, and I hope you had just as much fun as I did. Until next time, thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have a happy holiday.